Thomas was nervous. He knew this moment would come sooner or later, but still, when Jessie said that today they would go to her parents, his heart almost burst out of his chest. He was ready for anything, but not for what he would see. Meeting your parents is always important, especially when you don't know who is waiting for you. Jessie, in turn, tried to calm him down, saying that everything would be fine, but her eyes, although they did not betray fear, betrayed a certain excitement. She knew her father well, and this was not just an acquaintance for her, but also a test of her choice. When they drove up to the house, Thomas immediately felt that everything was not as he had imagined. The house smelled of heavy alcohol, mixed with the smell of old wood and cigarette smoke. The door opened, and a middle-aged man stood before them with a stern look that left no chance for Thomas to feel comfortable. "So you're the guy who took my daughter?" His voice was rough and husky, with a faint hint of beer. It was more than just a question, it was an accusation. Thomas didn't know what to say. He could feel the man's gaze on him, so piercing that Thomas found it hard to breathe. He was tall, with strong features, and his dirty gray eyes were filled with such coldness that they could be compared to ice. This wasn't just Jessie's father, this was a man who saw danger in every new acquaintance. "Hello," Jessie tried to bring things into the picture, having long been familiar with this attitude. Her voice sounded slightly strained, but she still tried to remain calm. But her father didn't react to her words. He didn't take his gaze from Thomas, and that was even more unpleasant than his words. He took a step forward, and Thomas felt every inch of space begin to press against him. Jessie stood beside him, and Thomas could see her hands shaking slightly. This man was more than just a father, he was a shadow, hiding her entire family beneath his heavy gaze. "Yes, you're the same guy. Well, let's not waste time on idle chatter. I'll show you where they're waiting for you," he said coldly, turning back toward the house. Thomas intended to say something in response, but his words caught in his throat. They entered the house, and with every step Thomas felt his nerves tense up. The living room was too dark, full of old furniture and even older portraits on the walls. All of this created an atmosphere where no one felt comfortable, and Jessie looked no less tense. "You're not respecting your daughter if you keep going like this," Jessie's father muttered as they sat down at the table. His eyes still never left Thomas, and his tone was so sharp that Thomas felt every word piercing his soul. Thomas tried to answer, but his voice wouldn't come. The whole atmosphere was unbearable, and he could feel the heavy silence growing even thicker. Eventually, he realized that this wasn't just a meeting with Jessie's parents. This was a battle for a place next to her, for her respect, and for her heart. But was he ready to endure what lay ahead? Thomas was not prepared for what happened next. When Jessie led him into the house, he could immediately sense the tense atmosphere. The house was old, too dark, and even the walls seemed to whisper of their difficult past. Thomas could see Jessie was a little nervous, but she was trying to stay calm. She took a few steps forward, but her father stopped her again. "Stop," his voice was sharp, and Thomas felt his heart skip a beat again. The man standing before them was much larger than Thomas had imagined. He wasn't just tall, he was huge, like a wall, with a heavy gaze and broad shoulders. He didn't look like the man Thomas would have imagined Jessie's father to be. This man seemed more like an enemy than a family member. "So you're the same guy?" he exclaimed, looking at Thomas. His face was lined with rough lines, and his gray eyes were so fierce that Thomas felt his inner peace begin to melt. The man took a step forward, and Thomas felt all his confidence melt away. This wasn't just a meeting. This was a test. Thomas couldn't answer right away. He could feel his breathing getting hard, and his chest was tight. He tried to gather his thoughts, but this man, this father of Jessie's, was far more threatening than he had imagined. Jessie didn't look surprised. She was aware, and her gaze remained cool and reserved, but her lips trembled with worry. She took a step toward her father, trying to smooth things over. "Dad, it's Thomas," she said, trying to speak calmly. "He's not a bad guy. But her father ignored her. He slowly turned to Thomas and took another step forward, his large body looming over him, and Thomas felt like he was in a cage, with no chance of escape. "I see," he muttered, looking Thomas up and down. "I'll keep an eye on you." Thomas, standing silently, only nodded, feeling how with each of his movements this man seemed closer and larger. Now this was not just a meeting, it was a test of endurance and determination. And then, finally, he forced himself to say, "I respect Jesse, and I want you to know it." Jesse's father looked at him again, his gaze so cold that Thomas thought he was frozen. "We'll see how much you respect her," he said ominously. It was not just a threat. It was a duty. From now on, Thomas understood that his place here would be under constant control. And he would have to prove every step he took. Feeling every second as a test, Thomas found himself more and more immersed in the atmosphere, where his every move was under the close attention of this man. Jessie stood next to him, her gaze still fixed on her father, but she knew that here and now it was difficult for her to change anything. Her dad was not an ordinary father. There was no tenderness, no peace in him, there was only anger and unforgiveness. Thomas felt this look, this coldness piercing him to the very bones. "You are disrespecting your daughter if you continue like this," Jesse's father muttered, his eyes never taking his eyes off Thomas. His words were like sharp knives digging into the soul, making every nerve tremble with pain. The man took a step forward, his large, unfriendly silhouette covering them both, and Thomas felt the air become heavy, suffocating. Thomas tried to compose himself, but his voice still remained on the verge. He could not find the right words. He knew that any mistake could lead to even greater danger, even greater despair for Jesse. And he didn't want that. I respect Jesse," his words finally found their way out, but they sounded like a faint whisper in the storm. "I want to be with her, I want you to know that. I don't want to hurt her." The words failed to break the wall between him and Jesse's father. He just looked at him, and his lips smiled slightly, but it wasn't the smile of a kindly man. It was the smile of someone who had heard such words 100 times and knew they didn't matter. "I don't want to hear your excuses," he said. "Nobody needs you here. You're just a guest." Thomas felt his heart ache at those words. But what hurt even more was that Jessie stood there, silent. She didn't try to protect him. It wasn't out of indifference. It was because she knew how this man operated, and every word she said would be just a drop in the ocean of anger. She had been under that shadow for a long time and could not escape its embrace. So she remained silent, her eyes filled with the same pain that Thomas had. And in that moment, when Thomas felt his throat tighten and every step seemed unreal, he realized, he had no right to win this battle. He respected Jesse, and he would have to go through this hell to prove it. Feeling every second as a test, Thomas found himself more and more immersed in the atmosphere, where his every move was under the close attention of this man. Jessie stood next to him, her gaze still fixed on her father, but she knew that here and now it was difficult for her to change anything. Her father was not an ordinary father. There was no tenderness, no peace in him, there was only anger and unforgiveness. Thomas felt this look, this coldness piercing him to the very bones. "You are disrespecting your daughter if you continue like this," Jesse's father muttered, his eyes never taking his eyes off Thomas. His words were like sharp knives digging into the soul, making every nerve tremble with pain. The man took a step forward, his large, unfriendly silhouette covering them both, and Thomas felt the air become heavy, suffocating. Thomas tried to compose himself, but his voice still remained on the verge. He could not find the right words. He knew that any mistake could lead to even greater danger, even greater despair for Jesse. And he didn't want that. I respect Jesse," his words finally found their way out, but they sounded like a faint whisper in the storm. "I want to be with her, I want you to know that. I don't want to hurt her." The words failed to break the wall between him and Jesse's father. He just looked at him, and his lips smiled slightly, but it wasn't the smile of a kind man. It was the smile of someone who had heard such words 100 times and knew they didn't matter. "I don't want to hear your excuses," he said. "Nobody needs you here. You're just a guest." Thomas felt his heart ache at those words. But what hurt even more was that Jessie stood there, silent. She didn't try to protect him. It wasn't out of indifference. It was because she knew how this man operated, and every word she said would be just a drop in the ocean of anger. She had been under that shadow for a long time and could not escape its embrace. So she remained silent, her eyes filled with the same pain that Thomas had. And in that moment, when Thomas felt his throat tighten and every step seemed unreal, he realized, he had no right to win this battle. He respected Jessie, and he would have to go through this hell to prove it. Thomas felt the pressure build with every second. Jessie's father was watching him like a predator on his prey, and he, in turn, was just trying to stay calm. He was already beginning to doubt whether he could make it through this ordeal, whether he could withstand this tension without breaking. All this time, Jessie stood by, her nerves on edge. She didn't have the strength to intervene, even if her heart was breaking as she watched her father, like a shadow, slowly strangling Thomas with his gaze. "You do realize that you're not just my daughter's boyfriend?" Jessie's father spoke again, his voice hard, cold, and every word felt like a blow. "You're here because my daughter chose you. But I'm not sure you're worth it yet." Thomas tried to pull himself together, not to allow himself to break in the face of this attack. He knew this was the moment he had to make a choice, to stay standing or to show his weakness. "I don't want to hurt you," Thomas said quietly, feeling his voice shaking, but he held on. "But I want to be with your daughter, and I respect her. And I'm willing to go through anything to earn your approval." The entire room seemed to fall silent for a few seconds. The living room was filled with the smells of old furniture and dirty walls, but more importantly, Thomas began to feel his resolve grow with every word he spoke. He wasn't just standing there, he was fighting for his love, for the chance to be with Jessie. And he was willing to fight, even if it meant breaking down the walls between him and her father. But Jessie's father didn't change his expression. He didn't answer right away, and it felt like an impenetrable wall. "We'll see," was all he said after a few moments of silence. "You'll prove it. But if you want to be with my daughter, you have to go through this, and I'll watch you. You won't derail us if you're not up to the task." Thomas felt his heart beat faster, but it wasn't fear, it was a challenge. He knew he had to keep going, and he had to go through whatever it took. And he was ready to do it. He looked at Jessie, and in her eyes he saw support, and it gave him strength. Every word he said, every look Jessie's father gave him, felt heavy, like a stone resting on Thomas's shoulders. The living room was cold, with a heavy air, and everything around seemed unreal. All eyes, even the silent ones, were focused on him. Thomas began to feel every cell in him tense, every muscle constricting his movements. But he knew that now he could not retreat, even if it became difficult for him to breathe. Jessie was still standing next to him, her hand holding him tightly, but this time her support was not as strong as before. Her gaze was full of anxiety and uncertainty. She knew her father well and how cruel he could be, especially at moments like this. "You don't understand that you have no place here," Jessie's father repeated his words, but this time he came closer, looking Thomas in the eyes again. His eyes were cold as ice, with no emotion behind his every move. "And if you think it's going to be that easy, you're dead wrong." Thomas took a step forward, feeling the heavy shadow of the man looming over him. But he knew this was his moment, when he had to say everything that was in his heart. It was the only way he could show that he was willing to go through all this to be with Jessie. "I don't want to break your rules. But I love your daughter, and I'm willing to walk this path." His voice was firmer than he had expected, and the words finally sounded free, not lost in fear. Meanwhile, Jessie stood, her gaze down, her hands still tightly gripping his, as she tried to find at least some support to help her get through this ordeal. She knew that her father would not be so easily convinced. And even her own feelings for Thomas now seemed insignificant compared to what her father was demanding. "You're not ready for this yet," Jessie's father said firmly, but his gaze had changed, becoming less aggressive and more cold. "I'll be watching you, every step you take. If you can't take it, I'll be there to show you how it ends." Thomas felt those words hit him hard. He had no choice but to really prove his resolve. He had to go through this fire and keep his love for Jessie. And he was ready to fight for it. "I can," Thomas answered firmly, although there was still uncertainty in his heart. The answer wasn't certain, but it was important to him. It was confirmation that he was ready to stay. Meanwhile, Jessie turned to him and looked at him as if those words meant more to her than he could imagine. Her eyes sparkled with emotion, and she only said quietly, "I believe in you." These words were the emotional reassurance that Thomas needed to understand. There was a lot of struggle ahead, but he was not alone. It was a moment when all words were left behind. Thomas understood that his presence here was no longer just a part of an acquaintance. This was a battle, and he could not afford to retreat, even as everything around him collapsed. His heart was beating fast, but he knew that this was only the beginning, a real test for him, and for Jessie. Jessie's father stood looking at him with a coldness that penetrated every cell of his body. The tone with which he spoke was so harsh that Thomas felt it every time those cold eyes looked at him. "You thought it would be that easy?" His father's voice sounded dull, without illusions, as if he had seen 1,000 such situations, and each of them had ended the same way, in defeat. But Thomas could not afford to lose. "I don't think it's easy. I know I will work to be with Jessie, and I will go through any trials to do so." His voice was firm, though inside Thomas was scared. Scared that everything depended only on him. "And how will you prove that you are worthy?" His father took a step forward. Every movement he made was full of aggression. But Thomas did not back down. "Every day, every step, I will prove that I can," Thomas replied, standing still, not trying to escape what awaited him ahead. Everyone present was silent, and there was immense tension in that silence. Jessie stood nearby, her eyes filled with the same pain that Thomas felt, and she seemed not to know how to help. She understood that her father would not forgive, but she also knew that Thomas would not give up. "It won't be easy," his father said, looking at Thomas again with a look that made the air around him feel heavy. "I will watch you, and if you make even one mistake, I will not let you be with my daughter." Thomas felt his father's every word sink into him. But he did not back down. He knew that this was the moment when he needed to show his determination. And he was ready to go through whatever it required. "I am ready," he said, and it was more than just a word. It was confirmation that he was not afraid. That he was ready for any hardship to stay with Jessie. Meanwhile, Jessie turned to him and said just one word. "I believe in you." That was all he needed to gather all his strength and get through what lay ahead. And he knew that this fight was only just beginning.